as I did my research about Dr. Rush, and I named the presentation a founder and physician because he is both a signer of the Declaration of Independence as well as a physician, not just in Philadelphia, but even the physician of many of the other founders when they were in the Philadelphia area. I'm guessing I've learned that some people are very familiar with Benjamin Rush, and some people, even if they're familiar with US history and the Revolutionary period, really have never heard of Benjamin Rush. But that's what I hope to fill in so that everyone learns at least a little bit something more that they didn't know about this important early American. First, Benjamin Rush was born, depending on which time frame you look at, when the British calendar changed. He was either born on Christmas Eve of 1745 or in January of 1746, but I'll go with the new time frame. He's very much a person of the middle colonies. So I'm showing a map there of what became the 13 colonies and eventually the eastern states. But Rush was born in a suburb of Philadelphia, Byberry. He was the fourth of 7 children. His father, who was a blacksmith, died when he was just 6 years old. And in order to financially support this growing family, his mother kept a grocery shop in Philadelphia. And then at age 8, she saved enough money so that Benjamin was able to enter an academy in Maryland run by his uncle, the Reverend Samuel Finley. And there you see a picture of his uncle, Samuel Finley. And my little asterisk there is just a reminder to me, as well as a heads up to the audience, that I'll be referencing whoever's name has the asterisk next to it in a subsequent slide. That there are times when it's important to retain that. Okay, so that was Benjamin Rush's early years. His early education, he enters the College of New Jersey, now known as Princeton. You can see Nassau Hall there in a modern day picture, and Nassau Hall did exist at the time. He graduated at the age of 14, a very young age, very intelligent, very hardworking, very bright student, also with a kind of a playful personality. There's a story about Rush, even at the age of 14, participating in the commencement exercises at Nassau Hall and giving kind of a humorous presentation that at least was memorable enough that it was captured in the documentation about that commencement in those days. Then after graduating Princeton, he considers entering the law, which is what the then president of Princeton was encouraging him to do. But instead, he follows his uncle, the Reverend Finley's advice, and pursues medicine. So he becomes a medical apprentice in Philadelphia for the next 5 years. And as fate would have it, in 1766, during the last days of his apprenticeship as a physician, he winds up treating that same uncle, the Reverend Finley, who at that time was then the president of the College of New Jersey, through his last days. And young Benjamin, the physician, it's reported, stayed up every night for several weeks during his uncle's final illness until he succumbed to it. Then to continue his medical studies, he travels to Europe for the next few years, specifically Edinburgh, Scotland, which was then the medical center of the world. Edinburgh University was where you went if you were a member of the British Empire, as Rush was, if you wanted to study medicine. And he receives his physician's degree, his medical degree, from Edinburgh University after just 2 years of study. He establishes many friendships while he's at Edinburgh, including with a man named William Leslie, whose name will appear in a subsequent slide. And he collaborates with Princeton's own Richard Stockton, who's also in Edinburgh at the time. They collaborate in an attempt to recruit the Reverend John Witherspoon, who is a well-regarded Scottish Presbyterian minister. They want Witherspoon to become the next president of the College of New Jersey / Princeton, because Witherspoon is known to be a moderate. Amazingly enough, suspend your disbelief, at that time, there were two religious factions within Presbyterianism, a more conservative one and a more progressive one, more liberal one. And there was a lot of animosity in terms of what they believed was the right way to practice their faith. Witherspoon was perceived as someone who stood in the middle, if you will. Anyway, Witherspoon heard out, Stockton most especially, heard the pitch to come to the colonies, come to the colony of New Jersey, come to the College of New Jersey and become the university president. And Witherspoon was okay with it, but his wife was not. And in that era, some would perceive Witherspoon as, why don't you make the decision? Why are you letting your wife make the decision? But Witherspoon was smart enough, savvy enough to know that, no, if I'm going that distance, perhaps to spend the rest of my life in a distant place, it's very important that both my wife and I fully agree. The problem is that, and the quote is that his wife felt that the very mention of going to America made her physically ill. And she actually had a valid point, in the sense that if you know the history of Princeton and the legacy of the early presidents of the College of New Jersey, they did not have a long lifespan once they became president of the university. From the beginning, the first president in Elizabeth to Aaron Burr Sr. in Newark, and then coming to central New Jersey, coming to the town of Princeton, one after another, including Benjamin Rush's uncle that I mentioned before. They did not have a long life expectancy once they became president of Princeton. So Mrs. Witherspoon may have had a valid point, but ultimately it's young Benjamin who meets separately with Mrs. Witherspoon and just listens to her point of view, hears her out, doesn't dismiss it, listens to all of her valid concerns, and then calmly, patiently, understandingly, compassionately convinces her that it's ultimately the right thing for them to do. And both Mr. and Mrs. Witherspoon ultimately do come to the U.S., as evidenced by the statue of John Witherspoon at East Pine, just outside of East Pine Hall, near the University Chapel. That statue of John Witherspoon stands. And as some of you may know, the three gentlemen who are depicted on this slide, Benjamin Rush, Richard Stockton, and John Witherspoon, were all signers of the Declaration of Independence. Rush for Pennsylvania, Stockton and Witherspoon for New Jersey. After successfully recruiting Reverend Witherspoon, Rush returns to America. He establishes a very successful medical practice in Philadelphia. And interestingly, he treats both whites and blacks, poor and wealthy patients. In those days, medical care was all house calls. The physician got in their carriage or on their horse or on foot and visited those who he knew needed his help, his medical care. And the notion of a physician treating both whites and blacks, treating both the poor and the wealthy, was not a common habit for most physicians. But Rush had in addition to his medical skills, he had an ethic informed by his Christian faith that the right thing to do is to treat all people equally. So he made good money when treating the wealthy, including some of the other founders who were visiting Philadelphia, but also treated any number of people who he knew could not pay him. He married Julia Stockton, daughter of that same Richard Stockton and his wife Annis Boudinot Stockton. And you can see a picture of their house, Morven, also in Princeton, not too far from Nassau Hall and the university, where the Stocktons live. Julia gave birth to 13 children, 9 of whom lived past the first year, including 2 sons that I want to take note of. One is John, and the second is Richard Rush. Then the revolution happens in America. Rush is still living primarily in Philadelphia, as is Julia, but as the war threatens, especially Julia and the children's safety, she often visits her parents at Morven in Princeton, or travels to other locations in the colonies further distant from any of the military skirmishes. He collaborates with Thomas Paine on a pamphlet that Paine initially wants to call Simple Truth. And Rush meets Paine in a bookstore in Philadelphia, and they have a shared interest. They are among the people within Philadelphia at the time, before the revolution, who felt that, okay, it's time for us to take the big step and pursue independence and to break away from Great Britain. Paine and Rush collaborate somewhat on the pamphlet that Paine ultimately publishes under the title that Rush suggests, called Common Sense. And Rush notes that it's a risky pamphlet to write and publish. Better that a freelance writer write it under his name than a successful physician. He encounters John Adams outside of Philadelphia when Adams is on his way from Massachusetts to attend the First Continental Congress. And Rush is a member of the Sons of Liberty in Philadelphia. He's still very young, still very energetic, and he has a private conversation with John Adams and some of the others from Massachusetts and says, "We understand your anger about what happened, what's happening in Boston right now. But we advise you strongly to not use the word independence during your time in Philadelphia. Because right now, Philadelphia is actually in a relatively good spot. We're not in the same position that you are with the British up in Massachusetts. So if you talk about independence, the public isn't ready to hear it, and to, in general, to support your point of view." Additionally, Rush advises John Adams that if he takes the lead, if he thinks that this is all going to be about Massachusetts, it's going to be challenging to ultimately win the Revolutionary War. It's key that Virginia take the lead in as many places as possible in that First Continental Congress and subsequent. So if you think about the key players and the people that John Adams either nominated or selects that played key roles during those days, everything from nominating George Washington to be the commander of the Continental Army, encouraging Richard Henry Lee to be the one to make the motion at the Second Continental Congress for independence of Virginia. And then third, Adams deferring to Thomas Jefferson, another Virginian, to draft the Declaration of Independence on behalf of that Committee of Five. at the Second Continental Congress. Rush becomes a delegate and signer for Pennsylvania, replacing his close friend, John Dickinson. Dickinson was not willing to sign the Declaration of Independence at the time. Not that he wasn't for independence, he just felt that it was a little bit too soon and still wanted to make some last overtures for peace to the king. And there you can see Rush's signature as it appears on the Declaration and the presentation of that Committee of Five with Adams, Jefferson, and the others presenting that to John Hancock. Somewhere amid that group, sitting behind them and standing behind them, is indeed Benjamin Rush and the rest of the people portrayed in that painting from that moment in history. And Rush establishes and maintains deep, enduring friendships with John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and any number of the other key players during the Revolutionary period. It's worth noting that Rush is perhaps the top physician in Philadelphia at the time, and you've got Adams, for example, traveling from Massachusetts, Jefferson traveling from Virginia, and all the other delegates coming a distance far removed from their own personal physicians. Any medical care that they needed or people of their household that they brought with them might need, Benjamin Rush was commonly the person they called upon. In terms of the battles of Trenton and Princeton, here's probably a familiar painting of the Battle of Princeton, and we'll focus on that for a bit. Rush was a participant in the crossing of the Delaware. He was then a member of the Continental Congress. So in some sense, a representative of the people who had chosen Washington to be the commander-in-chief, as well as a medical advisor, and kind of a surgeon general at the time. So Washington and he had any number of discussions about the welfare of the troops from a medical perspective. So focusing in on John Trumbull's painting, the figure shown directly behind General Washington is Benjamin Rush. He yielding a sword is pretty unlikely. I haven't, in the research that I didn't find any instance where Rush himself took up arms. He was more supporting the troops and keeping the troops healthy rather than being a combatant himself. Including, again, focusing on the painting, the death of General Hugh Mercer, who himself was also a physician, who was bayoneted multiple times by the British. But what probably cost Mercer his life a few days later was that he was struck on the head, on the back of the head, a severe blow with a musket by a British soldier. And Rush was the person who treated Mercer at the Clark House, which still stands adjacent to Princeton Battlefield. Interestingly, the painting also depicts the death of Captain William Leslie, a Scottish officer of the British Army. And you may remember from a previous slide, Leslie was one of the people that Rush had a deep friendship and fondness for from his days in Scotland. When Rush finds out that Captain Leslie has been killed on the battlefield, even though he's a British officer, Rush is heartbroken. And it becomes known to General Washington that Captain Leslie was a close friend of Benjamin Rush's, and therefore Washington agrees that full military honors will be given to William Leslie's corpse, and that appropriate burial will be made. He's not actually buried, though. Leslie is not buried at Princeton. There's a separate story that I won't go into, Leslie's body is actually buried in Pluckerman, New Jersey, in the graveyard of the Presbyterian Church. And I went there actually today to find the grave. It's pretty obvious where it is, but you can see there's a Scottish flag and a British flag. And the tombstone, that's not the original tombstone, but it is a close replica that was constructed shortly after the original crumbled, that indeed says that the tombstone was paid for, supplied by Dr. Benjamin Rush of Philadelphia. But despite the close relationship with Washington that Rush had, there's a part of their relationship that gets deeply strained. Rush is a strong advocate for just military camp hygiene. Keep the place where the latrines separate from where the soldiers eat. If soldiers are severely ill, move them to a separate place rather than being in close proximity to the healthy soldiers. He writes multiple times to Washington about these sensible points and doesn't hear anything back. And Rush is frustrated and impatient, and he thinks Washington is ignoring him. He writes a letter to, of all people, to Patrick Henry of Virginia, and basically questioning, is Washington the right person to lead the army? And he closes the letter by saying, please don't share this letter with anybody else. It's private. Well, as it turns out, after Henry receives the letter, Washington enacts basically all of the things that Benjamin Rush had asked to be done to preserve the health of the Continental soldiers. Henry chooses to share the letter with Washington. Rush hadn't signed it, but Washington and Rush had enough correspondence that Washington immediately recognized Rush's handwriting, and Washington feels like a close friend, a confidant of mine, is now saying negative things about me behind my back via his letter to Patrick Henry. Washington never, although they reconciled somewhat, Washington never fully forgave and held Rush with the same regard. And Rush regretted writing and sending that letter. When years later, when he became Chief Justice, John Marshall wrote an extensive positive biography of Washington after Washington died. The letter was included in that biography. Rush separately contacted John Marshall and asked that, although the letter could appear, that Rush's name not appear in association with that letter. And indeed, Marshall complied with that request. Rush, after the war, Rush then gets involved in several areas I'll call as revolutions in American society. His Christian faith informs a lot of Rush's attitudes, not just towards medicine, but towards society in general. At one point, he writes, a friend of his, people say that I'm an aristocrat, people say that I'm a Democrat, people say that I'm a Republican. I characterize myself as a Christocrat, meaning that my political views, my social views are all informed by my Christian foundation. So, for example, he does advocate for the teaching of the Bible in public schools, and Christianity specifically. But at the same time, he has a strong advocacy for freedom of religion and what the First Amendment to the Constitution says. He also encourages Thomas Jefferson to publish what we now know to be called as the Jefferson Bible, where Jefferson goes through the New Testament and removes the parts that he believes didn't really happen and leaves the parts that he believed did happen in the life of Jesus and in the things that Jesus taught and said. Kind of controversial for that time frame, but Rush is among those who's aware that Jefferson is writing this and encourages Jefferson's freedom of religion, if you will. Rush, informed again by his Christianity, helped organize the first anti-slavery society in America. He writes several pamphlets talking about the injustice, not just from human to human, but from an economic standpoint, that slavery doesn't really make sense. If we're going to be in a country that espouses that all men are created equal and women are created equal, then how can we be a society that legalizes slavery? He wasn't alone there, but he was certainly a strong voice in abolition and the anti-slavery movement in America. On that same theme, he helped establish the first two Black churches in Philadelphia, with Richard Allen shown on the left and Absalom Jones shown on the right. Those two churches still exist, and it's Rush who helped get the financing and the organizing and the documentation needed for those churches to get established. Rush tells a story about how when one of those churches was having its celebratory grand opening banquet, the way the banquet was conducted was first, the white people sat down at table and the Black people brought them their food. And then the Black people sat down and the white people came and brought the Black people their food. Kind of a radical but deeply symbolic and important moment at that period in American history. But Benjamin Rush also owned a slave. And he also believed, based on his understanding, that dark skin color was a curable disease. He actually felt that there were certain diseases that African Americans were immune to, that white people were not immune to. And I'll touch on that on the next slide. In terms of a healthy growth of American society, a variety of things that Benjamin Rush got involved in. Most extremely was the yellow fever epidemic in Philadelphia of 1793. Philadelphia at the time was the largest city in America, about 50,000 inhabitants, and about 1 in 10 people died of yellow fever during that epidemic, during the summer and fall of 1793. No one really knew the cause. All they knew was that someone literally could be perfectly healthy first thing in the morning, and by the end of the day, they had died a horrible death through yellow fever. Rush, knowing what he knew, and we now know that this was not the right treatment, followed the practice that he was taught and practiced of bleeding and purging. In those days, physicians believed, not knowing about what we know about the causes of diseases. The belief was that the body needed, that the balance of the elements in the body were out of balance, and therefore you needed to remove blood from the ill person and give them laxatives that would empty their intestinal tract, and that was the solution to how you made people better. Rush is known for putting this into practice, but again, he was not alone in following that those practices of bleeding and purging. In fact, story I read about the death of General Washington, George Washington, it wasn't so much that Washington died from the respiratory infection that he initially got, it was the fact that he, Washington, insisted that his doctors bleed him extensively as a remedy to that respiratory illness, and that's ultimately what killed Washington. But Rush advocates for a whole series of public health reforms. He wants advocates for free public education for all people, including women, which was radical at the time. He wants prison reform. He gets involved with the Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia. You may be familiar with that institution, which is built around that time. He perceives alcoholism, especially the drinking of hard liquor, more as we would call it today an addiction, as a disease, that it's not so much a moral choice that the alcoholic is choosing to drink. It's more something physical that they can't overcome on their own. And similarly, mental illness. That's the term that we use, mental illness, as opposed to lunatic or crazy or out of his mind. We view conditions like depression and other mental illnesses indeed as illnesses and treat them accordingly. Sadly, but importantly, Rush saw this firsthand with his own son, John. John Rush was in the military. He had anger management issues, apparently, and alcohol issues. He got in an argument with one of his colleagues in the Army. They got in a fight, they got in a duel, and John Rush killed the fellow soldier and never fully recovered from it. So John Rush wound up being put in a room where he was barely taken care of, unclean, unkempt, and was there for decades until he ultimately died. Rush saw the example of his son and others who he knew who were treated that way with mental illness with compassion, and saw them as human beings who needed to be treated just like any other of his patients. In fact, the American Psychiatric Association views Dr. Benjamin Rush, and you can see there from their insignia, views Dr. Benjamin Rush as the father of American psychiatry. And they have a plaque at his grave that states so. Rush also helps fund and organize the creation of two then Western colleges, Dickinson College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and Franklin and Marshall College in Lancaster. Dickinson, Rush has named for his friend John Dickinson. You remember he had replaced John on the Second Continental Congress representing Pennsylvania. And Rush also assists Meriwether Lewis. Meriwether Lewis is advised by then President Thomas Jefferson as far as the Corps of Discovery. Meriwether Lewis, among his first stops in organizing that expedition, is to Philadelphia to meet with Dr. Rush to get his advice on how to provide basic medical care to the men who went on that expedition. And interestingly, the only person who died on the Lewis and Clark expedition was a Sergeant Floyd, who had apparently appendicitis. And no one, even if he was in Philadelphia, would have been able to save his life. So it's remarkable that no one from the Corps of Discovery, the Lewis and Clark expedition, lost their lives over the extensive period that they were away from civilization and the rest of America. But remember the bleeding and purging. One of the things that Rush gave to Meriwether Lewis was laxative pills that were, I'll say, explosive in their effectiveness. They had mercury in the pills They were known as Rush's thunderbolts. And one historian commented that we know where Lewis and Clark went because we know where Lewis and Clark went, meaning that if we track where the Mercury is, we know where the Corps of Discovery set up camp for the journey. But Rush also had a specialty, again informed by his Christian faith and his consciousness of healing relationships. Most particularly John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, with whom he remained somewhat friends. Now they're physically removed from each other, right? After Adams and Jefferson had served their respective presidency terms, Adams goes back to Quincy, Massachusetts, and Jefferson goes back to Monticello in Virginia. But due to the animosity, the absolutely bitter political campaign of 1800 between Adams and Jefferson, the friendship between Adams and Jefferson is completely broken. They don't want anything to do with each other. And for a time, Adams doesn't want anything to do even with Benjamin Rush, although from a social standpoint, Rush is a closer ally with Adams. During the elections of both 1796 and 1800, Rush supports Jefferson for the presidency. And there's Benjamin Rush at a similar age towards the end of his life, just saddened and puzzled, wishing he could do more to reconcile the broken relationship between Adams and Jefferson. He first reaches out to both of them separately and encourages them to reach out to each other. He says, you two were the North and South Pole of the American experiment. Many people thought, but the two of you wrote and led us to create this great country. It would be awful as we approach the end of our lives if you can't reconcile the rift in your relationship. Finally, Adams writes to Jefferson after years of Rush lobbying him to do so. And Adams writes to Jefferson and says, you and I ought not to die before we have explained ourselves to each other. They both know they're kind of keeping track, almost like high school reunions, where you reach a certain age where you're keeping track of how many of your classmates are still alive. Well, Adams and Jefferson are doing the same thing with the signers of the Declaration of Independence back in 1776. Adams sends Jefferson a book that his son John Quincy had written, and Jefferson helped raise John Quincy when they were in France. And Jefferson graciously responds and says, a letter from you calls up recollections very dear to my mind when we were in the same cause, the right of self-government. And from that point forward, Adams and Jefferson exchange an abundance of letters. And sometimes Adams tries to push Jefferson's hot button about something. And because Adams just loves a fight, he's a lawyer through and through. And Jefferson wisely waits patiently. He either ignores the button that Adams tried to push, or responds with kindness or humor. They know now, as they approach their last days, that keeping their relationship, even through letter writing, is critical, not just to them as individuals, but to the nation that they founded. When Rush finds out that they have reconciled and are exchanging amicable letters, he writes to Adams, I rejoice in the correspondence which has taken place between you. I consider you as the North and South Poles of the American Revolution. And Rush is fearful that Adams or Jefferson is going to die without that reconciliation. It's Rush himself who actually dies before Adams or Jefferson do. And as you may know, Adams and Jefferson, amazingly enough, both die on the 4th of July, the 50th anniversary of the revolution, of the Declaration of Independence, July 4th, 1826. And that reconciliation is largely due to Benjamin Rush. In memoriam to Benjamin Rush, this is from the wall inside the University Chapel at Princeton. And you can see, hopefully you can see the names that are inscribed on the wall. Upper left corner is Benjamin Rush, signer of the Declaration of Independence, and a graduate of Princeton in 1760. His father-in-law, Richard Stockton, also a signer of the Declaration of Independence, President John Witherspoon, all three of whom we've talked about before, or I've talked about before. But the fourth one I haven't talked about, Richard Rush, who I did mention in a previous slide, son of Benjamin Rush, statesman and diplomat, also a graduate of Princeton. He becomes a member of the cabinet in both the Monroe administration as well as John Quincy Adams. So two different political parties. And yet Richard Rush is a member of the cabinet for both of them because he is competent, he is trusted, and he serves as Secretary of the Treasury, Secretary of the State. But importantly, around that same time frame, when John Adams and Thomas Jefferson die in July of 1826, it's Richard Rush who gives a speech to Congress, knowing Jefferson's very poor financial situation, that Jefferson is essentially a pauper as an ex-president. Richard Rush is the one who successfully makes the case to Congress that all presidents should be given some kind of pension, some kind of financial help in their last years. And that's what Richard Rush does. But he does it without revealing that John Adams and Thomas Jefferson had a rift that his father helped heal, because the American public doesn't know anything about that rift. They think that Adams and Jefferson are getting along just fine in their last years. It's only subsequently that those letters have been found, and Rush's role in healing the rift has come to light. This is Rush's grave itself at the same cemetery where a few other signers are also buried, most especially Benjamin Franklin. And this quote, "He aimed right," Rush told Adams that he kept kind of a diary, you might call it a burn book, where he wrote his own personal perceptions of as many of the founders as he knew firsthand. As many of the 56 signers of the Declaration that Rush had known personally. And he wrote descriptions of what was that person really like. For himself, he wrote the words, "He aimed right." He tried to do what he thought was the best thing to do. But Rush later tells Adams that he destroyed the book because he didn't want it published. And Adams says, "I can't believe you did that. That was like the most foolish thing you could have done." However, when Benjamin Rush dies, and he dies before Adams and Jefferson, both Adams and Jefferson contact Rush's family and say, "I've had some private correspondence with Dr. Rush, and I would greatly appreciate it if you would send me all of the letters that I sent him and he sent me. I just want to make sure that the general public isn't made aware of our correspondence." Anyway, that's who Benjamin Rush was. At this point, I'll take any questions, any comments, any feedback that you might have on anything that I covered. And the last photo that appears there, just under Dr. Rush, is me standing with a biography of Benjamin Rush in hand and standing underneath the statue of Benjamin Rush that is by Dickinson College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania.